Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
So thank you all very much for joining us this morning, this evening, this afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Michael Green. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS, a professor at Georgetown University in Washington. And we're delighted to have with us four of Japan's sharpest thinkers on Japan-China relations, which is our topic for today. This is part of the CSIS series, Strategic Japan. For over 8 years now, we have invited four or so rising stars, leading thinkers on foreign policy, defense, economic, technology, and global governance problems facing Japan and the United States. And we asked them to prepare a short paper and come to Washington, meet with experts in and out of government, scholars, refine their papers. We then publish them in an edited volume every year. We've had 29 of our strategic fellows visit. This year, of course, we're doing it virtually because of the pandemic, but with no less focus on their scholarship and the lessons for the US and Japan and other allies and partners. We started the program with the help of the Japanese government to try to do several things. We wanted to get more second track dialogue going on the key issues that were facing the US and Japan and other allies and partners and friends, not only in Asia, but around the world. Second, we wanted to help our scholars from Japan increase their network, their connectivity, their expert counterparts in the US as they conducted their work. And third, we wanted to really come up with some new ideas, some new ways of thinking about foreign policy problems. And in this, we're very, very pleased with the success of this program so far. And I think as the Lowy Institute in Australia argued last year when it assessed different power in Asia, it said Japan is now the smart power, is the leader of the liberal order in Asia, is how the Lowy Institute in Australia put it. This is in part because the US is finding its bearings given our own domestic politics, but in part because within Japan's foreign policy community, thought leaders are really defining the agenda. If you look at both the Trump and Biden administration's policy towards Asia and towards competition with China, the key features include the Quad, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, infrastructure financing, things that essentially generated out of Japan's strategic community. And that both the Trump and now Biden administrations are embracing as core parts of our strategy for the region. These are really important reasons why the US and Japan are well aligned now, not perfectly aligned as we'll hear, but well aligned. And why, as we look at the challenges of China, we have a lot to learn from Japan, but also the US has an enormous stake in how Japan approaches China. The Japanese side in this game has developed an approach to China that includes very deliberate competition through economic, diplomatic, and military instruments, but also maintaining cooperation on the economy, on climate change, even on issues like North Korea. And we're going to learn more about that mix from our four scholars today and look forward to your questions. You can send the questions through the website and they'll be sent to me and I'll direct them to our four speakers. The four scholars this year for Strategic Japan, whom we'll hear from shortly, are Professor Rumi Aoyama, Director of the Waseda Institute of Contemporary Chinese Studies and Professor at the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies at Waseda University. Professor Aoyama has written a paper for us and we'll discuss where we are in the longer history of Japan-China relations. Second, Professor Masafumi Iida, head of the America, Europe, Russia Division Regional Studies Department at the National Institute for Defense Studies, NIDS. His paper and his presentation focus on Japan-China security issues. Third, Professor Asei Ito, Associate Professor at the Institute of Social Science at Tokyo University, one of the leading experts in Japan on the Chinese economy. He will be writing about where we are in Japan-China economic relations. Fourth, Professor Ichiro Inoue, Professor at the School of Public Policy Studies at Kwansei Gakuin University in Japan. Inoue-san is a former diplomat and will be writing on Japan-China ideational competition to define regional order in Asia and global order. I'll ask each of the panelists to give their brief introductory comments, and then I'll have one or two questions. I've asked my colleague, Matt Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics and Simon Chair, to comment on Professor Ito's paper and presentation on Japan-China economic relations. And we'll take your questions as you send them in and put those forward to our speakers too. So let me turn now to the first of our four strategic Japan scholars, and that would be Professor Aoyama. Over to you, Aoyama Sensei.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to share my views with you today. So in this project, my role is to cover the history of Japan-China relations. If we look back at the bilateral history of the past 70 years, we can see that Japan-China relations are fundamentally different from those in the 1970s and 1980s. So first of all, security concerns about China has become the major driving force behind Japan's current China policy. Because of China's coercive behavior in the waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands. So for the first time since the end of the the Second World War, Japan faced the need to defend its territory. Out of these security concerns, Japan is now making efforts to strengthen the US-Japan Security Alliance, enhance cooperation among the core. And on the security front, Japan has also taken the initiative to boost high-quality trade rules by concluding trade agreements such as CPTPP, RCEP, and Japan-EU TPA. But of course, economic relations with China is another key issue shaping Japan's strategic considerations. So Japan is also making efforts to ensure the security distrust does not affect economic ties. And if we look at the public polls in Japan, and we can see that those public polls also suggest that the public in Japan support Japan's this co-engagement policy towards China. And so far, I think Japan's engagement policy toward China is relatively very successful because economic relations and societal contacts with China have developed despite deepening distrust between the two countries. And also in Japan's economic strategy centered on promoting multilateral trade agreements have also enhanced Japan's normative power and could also have a positive effect on shaping China's behavior and also promoting economic integration in Asia. So my policy recommendation would be that although Japan is vital for Japan and other like-minded nations to strengthen their joint efforts to counter China's growing military might. But on the other hand, we should also continue to explore opportunities for confidence buildings in order to manage the maritime contingency. And also in terms, Japan and other Western democracies need to proactively take leadership roles in formulating high standard rules for the digital economy, and also in terms of people and cultural relations with China, because Japan has a very significant advantage in terms of soft power. And so in my opinion, we should continue to promote grassroots exchanges in such areas. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Aoyama Sensei. That was concise and rich at the same time. We're going to take questions from the audience towards the end of our hour, but let me ask you a few before we turn to the next speaker. As a historian of Japan-China relations, how do you look at the current engagement strategy, the mix of reasonably good economic relations, but very, very difficult security relations with China? Is this it's unfair to ask historians about the future, but considering the past, do you think we're entering a 10, 20, 30-year phase in Japan-China relations, a generational period, or do you think it's possible this is a shorter term period in the history of Japan-China relations?
I do think Japan-China relations have entered into a new phase. And although Japan's dedicate management dealing with China-Japan relations and the United States relations, well, it has been relatively successful, but I do think it has its limitation because as geopolitical competition with China intensifies, economic ties will eventually undermined. And also, if you look at the domestic public opinion in Japan, and the ideological battle with China has also looms ahead. So my opinion, well, in my opinion, I would say that we are entering into a new phase, and Japan is now trying to strengthen the U.S.-Japan relations and in order to counter the rising influence of China.
Right. I think that's probably how people in the U.S. see it as well. This is a generational period or epoch in U.S.-China relations as well. You said Japan's engagement strategy has been successful, in part because of shaping of Chinese behavior. Can you give us some examples where you think Japan has or may in future shape the way China behaves in Asia or towards the US, Japan, and other countries?
I think, I do understand there's a huge debate on whether or not we can shape China's behavior, whether or not we can shape China's foreign policy. But in reality, we can, if we look at Japan's initiative to conclude the CPTPP, and Japan's this kind of move on the Japanese part has actually promoted China to has the potential to promote further reform and market liberalization in China, because even Xi Jinping has expressed its intention to join CPTPP. And if you read the Chinese documents very carefully, you can see that the Chinese governmental officials also see that the high quality rules by the CPTPP represent the standards for future multinational trade agreements. So that is why China is trying, that's one of the reasons that China is trying to attend CPTPP. And by participating in CPTPP, China needs to further its market liberalizations and even political reforms as well. And also, if I have time, and also I think, Japan's initiative has also promoted to have also speed up the RCEP negotiations. And because of the CPTPP, the RCEP, the ASEAN countries has speeded up their negotiations of RCEP.
That's great. We'll come back to some of that, I think, with Ito Sensei's presentation and Matt Goodman's questions. Let me turn to now Professor Iida on that security relationship that is the driver of this new era in Japan-China relations. Iida Sensei, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Green, for your kind introduction. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my views on the China threat to Japan and also to the United States. So my paper examines the rapid rise of Chinese military capabilities and activities in East Asia, which poses significant threat to Japanese sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands and the US military presence in the region. Then I discuss the ongoing efforts and the limitations in the Japan's policies in adapting to the deteriorating security environment. I argue that the expansion of China's ambitions and capabilities will inevitably compel Japan to reconsider the traditional defense posture, focusing on the shield roles in the US-Japan alliance. I conclude that Japan should have long-range precision strike capabilities in order to enhance Japan's own deterrence to Chinese aggression against its territories, and to strengthen the deterrence of the US-Japan alliance to China's intentions and actions to change the status quo by coercion in the Indo-Pacific. So China has been significantly intensifying assertiveness around the Senkaku Islands in recent years. The China Coast Guard establishes permanent presence of its vessels around the Senkaku Islands and threatens Japan's security and sovereignty. The People's Liberation Army becomes more and more active and assertive to increase pressure on the self-defense forces. The enhancement of the PLA's A2AD capabilities makes it harder for the self-defense forces and the US forces to maintain air and maritime superiority around the first island chain. In response, Japan makes efforts in enhancing ISR capabilities, amphibious capabilities, and standoff strike capabilities. However, China's massive missile forces can severely damage the functions of the self-defense forces' critical infrastructures at the onset of a military conflict. So because the self-defense forces lacks the capabilities to counter-strike Chinese bases and infrastructures, the threshold for the PLA to launch land attack missile against Japan is relatively low. So this asymmetry in long-range strike capabilities gives China greater confidence in deterring Japan. So under these circumstances, I urge that Japan should acquire long-range precision strike capabilities. When Japan introduces conventional counter-strike capabilities, which can pose non-negligible military and political cost on the Chinese leadership, it is impossible for the PLA to achieve a decisive victory in a short period of war without damages and casualties. I think Japanese counter-strike capabilities will also reduce the China's expectations to prevent the US-Japan alliance from functioning by deterring US support to the Japan's defense operations against the PLA, because it becomes highly possible for the US forces to support the self-defense forces when Japan stands up to the Chinese aggression. And moreover, the counter A2AD capabilities of the US-Japan alliance will be enhanced when Japan increases its long-range strike capabilities, so which will contribute to enhancing the deterrence of the alliance. As recommendations for the Japanese and the US governments, I urge that the two major democracies need to substantiate common objective of deterring China's assertiveness to change the status quo through coercion. The self-defense forces and the US forces should form combined operational plans, conduct combined exercises, and share real-time information about Chinese activities in the East China Sea, which will contribute to closer coordination between the two countries. Finally, Japan and the United States need to accelerate defense cooperation across all domains, including space and cyberspace, and also promote the multilateral cooperation such as Quad and ASEAN-related frameworks as well. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ida Sensei. Your emphasis on strike is striking, is a key part of your approach, and within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, there's a lot of focus on strike capability. You say Japan needs the ability to hit deep into an adversary's territory, to hit infrastructure, to hit bases. My first question is, do you think that the Japanese diet and public supports that kind of strike, deep strike, deterrence by punishment, countervailing strike against infrastructure and bases? Do you think there's political support for that in Japan, or is your proposal, very forward-leaning? I think people will wonder about that. And second, what is your vision specifically for the U.S.-Japan alliance beyond coordination? If Japan has a strike capability of this kind, then that would be a change in the roles and missions traditionally governing U.S.-Japan security cooperation, where the U.S. is the spear, Japan is the shield. Do we need to redesign the U.S.-Japan alliance? Do we need joint and combined commands? Do we need some new security agreements? So how much support in Japan, for your view, do you think? And how much change is needed for the U.S.-Japan alliance to implement that proposal?
Well, thank you for this question. So first of all, I should admit that still there are many people opposing to this kind of new thinking about Japan to acquire the striking capabilities. But it's mainly because the long-rooted pacifism among the Japanese people. But I also should say that the public opinion about the Chinese assertiveness against Japan is rising. I mean, the more and more Japanese people are more and more cautious about their Chinese approach toward the Senkaku Islands or other the issues in the East China Sea and also the South China Sea. So I feel that the public opinion is gradually changing. If you compare the Japanese public opinions, the current public opinions with the 10 years ago, you can see the great change on the Japanese public opinions. And I also think that the debates in the Japanese politicians is also changing. And so now many of the Liberal Democratic Party's politicians clearly say that Japan should have some kind of striking capability, but still, these opinions doesn't face with the strong opposition opinions compared to the 10 years ago. So I think the possibility for the Japan to acquire more offensive capability is growing, and I think it is a kind of we have to do change. We have to change our defense posture to deal with the very severe reality that China poses to Japan. And as you said, that if Japan seeks for acquiring the more offensive capabilities, of course, Japan need to coordinate and deepen our cooperation or cooperations with the U.S. forces. That I don't say that Japan should have deep striking capabilities, but I would argue that Japan needs the capabilities to strike the coastal Chinese bases or infrastructures, which are the original places for attacking Japan. But still, we need more. We need the ISR capabilities to conduct this type of operations. So we need a more deep-rooted, coordinated cooperation with the US to conduct this type of operations. But still, the basic structures that Japan plays a major role in the shield, and the United States plays major roles in as a spear.
It is it is worth, I think, pointing out that the Japanese public in the last few years has seen satellite images released by the PLA, by the Chinese military, showing massive missile strikes against simulated targets of Japanese bases and urban areas. So this is not just coming out of nowhere. The Japanese public, and of course the Defense Ministry, has seen a very deliberate, very public Chinese effort to threaten Japan's bases and Japan's territory with missile strikes, which of course has been going on for decades, but now it's very publicly seen by the Japanese people. It's a strange world we live in, where we're going to shift from targeting Chinese port facilities to talking about how Japan can export more goods to Chinese port facilities, but that's the Japan-China world we live in. So let me turn next to our next speaker, Professor Ito, to talk about Japan-China economic relations.
Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. Thanks so much for such opportunities. I'm Asei Ito, specializing on the Chinese economy and also Asian economy more broadly. So my paper is entitled Japan's Economic Pragmatism, Cooperating and Competing with China. And it has three objectives in the paper. First, they contextualize the Japan's policy toward China, and the secondary, that the try to framing the Japanese policy, recent policy, especially during the Abe administration, and examine several key questions. So I think already, as the Professor Aoyama mentioned, the engagement, that the combination of the engagement and also other hedging strategy. And in fact, today's commentators, Mr. Goodman, have published a paper about the Japanese strategy. And in his paper, he summarized the Japanese policy, especially during the Abe administration. He said this approach is engaging where possible, hedging where necessary, and trying to uphold the international rule-based order. I think this is quite well summarized what was the Abe approach to the China over a decade. In my paper, in fact, I tried to look at the quite longer perspective. In fact, my first figure is showing the 150 years of the Japanese trade relationship with China. And before the World War II, about the average is about the 17% of Japanese trade is related to China. Then after the World War II, suddenly the share of China declined to less than 2%. So given the split due to the Cold War. And then after 1990, as you know, after the China's opening policy, the ratio goes up. Then now it exceeds more than 20%. That's even last year, 2020, given the pandemic, and we need to, import many products from China. So it exceeds nearly the 24%, or that one of the highest rate. So this is quite, challenging situation. And in my paper, also touch upon the Japanese companies' China Plus One strategy after especially the Senkaku maritime tensions. In fact, Japan's foreign affiliates, the share of China is declined over a decade. But still, the China is one of the largest economic interests for Japanese companies, and 30%, about 30% of Japanese foreign affiliates is in mainland China and Hong Kong. So that is the reality. Then another question is how deep Japan's hedging and engagement. And I guess it was also CSIS's paper that entitled the Decoupling Kabuki. I really enjoyed it to read such debate. And the major argument is that the last year the Japanese government initiated the supply chain diversification program, but the scale is quite limited. So that's the major point. But I think it's better to look around the more layers of Japanese approach to China. I would say there is the hedging side and also cooperation or engagement side, two sides. Then there's a surface layer and the middle layer and more bottom layer. Then surface layer can be done within one fiscal year or just short term. The middle layer, which contains the more legal settings, bilateral agreements, whatever. So we have the CPTPP in the hedging side, the RCEP in engagement side, this kind of balance. Then related question is what is the trajectory of Japan towards China today? And I think one of the open source information is that the last December, the ruling the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, have published a paper entitled Towards Developing Japan's Economic Security Strategy. It is a well summarized approach and recommending Japanese government to setting the comprehensive Economic Security Act next year, 2022. So in my paper, I just saying that the trajectory is going more hedging side. That's one of the key message. And finally, policy recommendation. To be honest, I have no major policy recommendation at this moment, but at least we can point out the several questions, points. First is the objective of China policy. What is the goal? What's policy goal do Japan and the United States share? This is quite fundamental question, I would say. And the former Vice President Mike Pence, his speech had saying that Chinese Communist Party CCP as a major threat to United States and other allies. And I have noticed that the recent paper entitled "The Longer Telegram," which focus on much more narrower group, right? So I think even more pragmatic approach would be keep focusing the trade rules, practice in that kind of economic dimensions. So in my personal view, and I state clearly in my paper, Japan would have less aggressive or moderate policy objective compared to United States, or at least compared to the Vice President, the Mike Pence speech. And the second quite fundamental question is the objective, related to objective is can we influence China's trajectory? I'm not sure. Because the China's policy decision-making process is increasing top-down. Then how can we make influence? Then I would argue that the hard-line approach taken by some of the Trump administration, it seems counterproductive in some area. For example, the Chinese government can implement much more aggressive semiconductor development, program, and also. So in Japan, the former Japanese ambassador to Beijing, Yuji Miyamoto, in his recent article that Japan's role is important in creating an environment in which China can change direction without compromising its own reputation or Chinese 面子. So I am sympathetic to the latter soft line approach, but it is also true that under the current situation, there are no guaranteed outcome in both the hard line approach and soft line approach, I would say. So that's I would say, to be honest, that's my my opinion. And also, yeah, finally, ultimately, my argument is only the domestic factor in China would shape China itself. One of the key element would be demographic transition in China. So in the China's working age population is start to decline already, and last year the new birth number of births is quite decreased rapidly. So that's one point in long run. So I stop here, but looking for many feedbacks. Thank you.
Ito Sensei, thank you. Very nuanced and very interesting. Let me turn it over to Matt to pick up the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And thank you, Ito Sensei. Really good presentation. And the paper is excellent. And I commend it to everyone to read the full paper when it's published. So let me ask one question that in a way may seg nicely into Inoue Sensei's paper afterwards, which is about your title of your paper says Japan's Economic Pragmatism. But throughout the paper and sort of my own observation of the Abe approach to China, there's pragmatism, but there's also strategy. And and there's ideology as well. If you consider, the free and open Indo-Pacific, or even terms like quality infrastructure and data free flow with trust, which are other Abe concepts, have values sort of imbued in them. So I guess my question is, how much has the approach been pragmatic? How much has it been based on ideology or values? And how sustainable is that post-Abe? Is this just Abe, or is there a deeper view in Japan that there ought to be a mix of pragmatism and ideology?
So may I
Yes, please.
answer right now? Yeah, thanks so much. Such a wonderful point. I think it's the I think there are still the diversified view in Japan as well. And the one camp, I would say, increasing camp, influencing camp, would argue the value or concept is very much important. But the another side, still there is a economic reality. I would say, the largest trading partner is China, and also given the China's gravitational effect, given the size of the Chinese market, this kind of thing is another reality, I would say. We need to really careful about that kind of the reality. I am an economist, so I do focus such the pragmatic, the history of Japanese policy. At least there is one line in Japan for at least maybe 70 years or even more to try to focus on the economic interest. But you are totally right that at this moment, at the age of the ending the post-Cold War, today is somehow new, Cold War period. Some of the media argue that's kind of thing. So maybe today is the point we need to seriously discuss how much we would put the importance on the value and the concept. And the I do share your comments and also suggestions. And in my paper, you read right. So I have referred the Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida's the statement that it is said that he said in 1949 when the PRC established, it is reported that he said it doesn't matter China's red or blue. We need to keep the trade relationship. That is I was really interested in such the view. Today, can we say that? Maybe no. We cannot say whether China, it doesn't matter whether China is red or blue. We cannot say, I would say, because given the size, given the importance, given the significance of China's influence in the global affairs and as well as regional affairs. We cannot say that, but still there is a certain economic reality. That's my feedback. Sorry.
Excellent. No, excellent. Let me just ask one more question, which is, you mentioned your taxonomy that sort of, you have a table on page 15 of your paper showing these different layers of hedging and engagement. And in the middle layer, which I consider one of the most important because it sort of links the deeper strategy with the sort of more superficial things that you can see on the surface. The first thing you put under hedging is CPTPP, the new version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this may tease out a policy recommendation from you, but given that the Biden administration is very chilly or not so interested in rejoining TPP on the one hand, and on the other hand, China is expressing interest in joining a TPP, as Professor Aoyama said, which seems to be, not clear how serious it is, but it's a real interest, apparently. What would you advise Prime Minister Suga to do or say, both, to President Biden when he comes here next week about CPTPP? What is the best approach for Suga-san to take to, to try to move forward on that particular layer of the hedging strategy on TPP?
Thank you so much. So I want to ask you. Yeah, that's a question, but
that's not the way it works. I asked the question.
But sure. Without United States in such economic, the agreements in broader sense, that's gonna be quite less productive, definitely. So even in 2017, when the Trump administration withdrawn from the negotiation of CPTPP, already in Japan there was a discussion. Let's wait for United States until they come back. And I heard that President Biden said the America is back. Am I right? So we are waiting for comeback. That's of course, but the more seriously speaking, that the middle layer is most important. That the and also the another one more foundational layer, we have the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. But I think theoretically it is very much good, focus. But I would say still it is a concept, not the materialize the initiative. So that's we need to the jointly I think develop such initiative. That's gonna be quite a long run project that we need to run together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ito Sensei, that was great. Yeah, you said you had no recommendations, but you just gave us a good recommendation, which is Japan's waiting for the U.S. on trade, so your recommendation should be hurry up.
I think so. But I don't represent all the the Tokyo, but my personal view. Thank you so much.
I also really like any reference to Yoshida Shigeru, who said it doesn't matter if China's blue or red. But I met someone who was in the foreign ministry, and Yoshida would greet every new class of foreign ministry diplomats and give them some advice. And Ambassador Kato Ryozo, who was the ambassador to the US, told me that he was one of the last entering classes in Gaimusho to meet Yoshida. And Yoshida leaned over his cane and said, "Look out for China," in the 1960s. So even Yoshida could see the need to hedge. So we've talked a lot about values and regional order and Japanese diplomats. So let's turn to former diplomat turned scholar and the author of our paper on values and regional order competition. Inoue Sensei.
Hi, good evening and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Green, and thank you for everyone for this opportunity. And my topic is Japan's ideational competition with China. And my name is Ichiro Inoue, and I'm a professor of the Kansei Gakuin University. And I'm a researcher of Chinese foreign policy. But today I'm going to talk about Japan's foreign policy toward China. And the ideational competition, this concept is very vague. And I think that the US approach and the Japan's approach is also different. And China already have surpassed Japan in terms of the GDP, as you know, and now almost 3 times larger than that of Japan. And today, I think the many Asian nations act as though they have no choice but accept the fate of China-centered regional order. So under that circumstances, Japan is still competing with China in the ideational dimension. And throughout Japan and China's long relationship, neither country has been on equal footing. And in that sense, as a Harvard professor, late Ezra Vogel, he's a prominent scholar both on Japanese and Chinese affairs. He pointed out an awareness of superiority in any historical moment is important when considering Sino-Japanese relations from the ideational perspective. And China has surpassed Japan in terms of hard power. And today's China tend to see Japan no longer a competitor. And in contrast, Japanese see themselves as living in a civil society under a democratic system. They will not accept China-centered regional order under its current authoritative government, which takes actions that are not based on universal rules and norms. And historically, Japan has not shown many diplomatic insistences on democratic values and human rights issues. But after Cold War, Japan's foreign policy gradually changed from a passive stance and expanding its ideational scope. And during Prime Minister Abe's unusually long premiership, universal values such as democracy, human rights, freedom, and the rule of law were embedded to some extent in Japan's diplomacy. Recent US-Japan 2+2 joint statement was notable for explicitly addressing a shared concern about China's behavior on Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and also Taiwan and South China Sea. And free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP concept officially appeared in Japan's diplomatic blue book in 2017. And the concept includes democracy and the rule of law and development based on the market economy. The Japanese government has expressed its views that FOIP will not compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and FOIP does not exclude China. However, in emphasizing freedom and democracy in FOIP, in my view, there is an unspoken competition with China. In terms of trade and economic policy, Japan has taken an initiative to conclude a comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, after Trump administration pulled out the TPP. Japan also trying to secure its presence in Southeast Asia. Although China has an overwhelming influence in this region, many Southeast Asian countries have a more democratic political system than China today. And trust in Japan is considerably high. And earlier this century, Japan-China conflict was outstanding among the nation's relationship with China. And the tensions between Japan and China were thought to be due to a special relationship between two countries, like historical issues and territorial issues. And Japan is located on the forefront of the rise of China. And the awareness of China's problem has been keen because of its geopolitical and historical proximity. However, as China becomes a global power and its presence and activities overshadow the world, and other democratic nations are facing problems that Japan has already experienced. There's now an expanding common ground among like-minded democracies to more strongly support the liberal international order. Japan, by cooperating with the United States and other democracies that have begun to share the sense of China's challenge, is trying to compete with China in a symmetrical way. Xi Jinping's second term will end next year, but under the current circumstances, it is highly likely that he will continue to be in power. During Xi's first and second term, it has become clear that Xi's China will not change its course in the foreseeable future. So finally, my policy recommendation is, number one, promote unification among the established democracies against China. That's not just about between Japan and the US, but also with some the major European countries. And also, number two, enhance ties with India, South Korea, and Southeast Asia. But those, I think, policies are already implemented, I think, by Biden administration. And lastly, I think that the cool down Chinese nationalism and separate Chinese society from its leadership. China tends to understand that the US confrontational attitude originates from a competition for hegemony. But China doesn't fully understand why more and more Western countries, besides the US, are also worried about China's recent actions. And the Trump administration's bold anti-Chinese China policy has raised nationalism and weakened the reasonable voices from liberal forces within China. So when criticizing China, separating China's specific policy and China itself might help reduce unnecessary nationalistic sentiment in China. Okay, I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Inoue Sensei. Let me ask one question, if I could. You described how values and ideational competition have become increasingly important in Japan's China policy and foreign policy. As a China scholar, how would you describe ideology in China's foreign policy? Do you think that Beijing is becoming more ideological, more zero-sum, more competition-oriented in defending and even advancing its own, authoritarian system? Is this part of the dynamic as well? Not just Chinese power and disruptive and coercive behavior, but do scholars like you in Japan see China also being aggressive on ideological and ideational competition?
Yeah, generally speaking, Xi Jinping's China becomes more the ideology-oriented, generally speaking. But I think that in terms of foreign policy, I think that we can observe that very nationalistic and very, especially in the field of sovereign issue-related areas, like Hong Kong or Taiwan, their stance is very tough. But different from the Cold War Soviet Union, China is still not very, active to export its the ideology to the rest of the world. So I think that the China's action is still basically originated from the not ideology but nationalism. Yes.
That's a very important distinction. It's not necessarily a reassuring distinction, but it's a very important distinction. So thank you. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So let me pick up a few of the questions. I think this one is for Aoyama Sensei, but Michito Iwata, who's a student in Seattle, asks about younger Japanese views of China. CSIS did a survey last fall and found that the American public has become very negative towards China, views China as a threat. Many polls show that. But in our poll, Americans in their 20s, younger Americans, were less worried about China. It was interesting. What do you know what the situation is in Japan? Are younger Japanese more nationalistic and more anti-China, or are they like younger Americans, a little bit more relaxed? Still negative, but not as worried as older Americans. How is the Japanese generational breakdown?
Well, I think because of the media reports in China, in Japan, and because of the assertiveness of China's foreign behaviors, so more and more Japanese people, including the younger generation, has been very, wary about China, and also. Because of the influence of social media, the younger generation are become more vocal, and they tend to publicly criticize China's political system and about China's suppression of human rights. So I would say the younger generation in Japan is more vocal and might be more anti-China. They have the sentiment of anti-China.
It's interesting. Our generational impressions are different between the US and Japan to some extent. We had a question from Dajit Singh in Singapore about whether Southeast Asia can really pick up the movement of supply chains out of China. So how much capacity is there really for Southeast Asia to pick up supply chains if Japanese companies move them out of Southeast Asia? And then we had a question from Tom Doty from Brandywine Global asking, if the US pushes Japan to have stricter export controls on critical semiconductor technologies or to move supply chains away from China, how will Japan respond? So I think, a number of questions about supply chain management, export controls. How much can Japan move out of China realistically, and how much, and where will it go? Southeast Asia. I think this is a good one for Ito Sensei and then maybe Iida Sensei. So Ito Sensei, what do you think? Right now, you said about 30% of trade and supply chains for Japanese multinationals are in China. Could that go down a lot? Is that possible?
Yeah, China plus one strategy has already initiated over, I would say, 15 years or at least 10 years. And the share of the Japanese affiliates overseas the China's share is somehow declining, but it's still 30%. That's the reality. And even there is a huge market and also supply chain agglomeration effect. So from the economic perspective, it is quite, I would say, difficult to diversify from the China. That's the one reality. But over 10 years, Japanese company tried to expand, the diversified supply chain, especially the Thailand, Malaysia, and also Vietnam recently, these kind of regions. I would say these regions, countries, have been accepted much the new projects over 10 years. So that's the situation. And then the question is the export control. That's a quite tough question. And Huawei itself, one company have purchased much of the Japanese components. That's the one situation. Also, in my paper, I have introduced the questionnaire survey result, and I asked the Japanese businessman if the U.S. government asked Japanese government to, practice the decoupling with China. Do you agree with that? In fact, the answer is quite diversified. Almost half is agree, half disagree. This kind of distribution. That's the situation. So, of course, the export control will be legal requirements. So many of the multinational companies, Japanese companies, have to, they follow the rules. But question is that China is also, enforcing the extraterritorial, law. That's a really tough situation at this moment. Maybe we need to look in the situation, the step by step. Of course, the Japanese government try to follow the rules, but sometimes the rule itself is unclear. So that's the situation. Yeah.
If your survey found about half of Japanese companies accept decoupling, that's probably higher than the number of American companies. So it's interesting. Very quickly, Iida Sensei, to finish, do you think on the national security side, there will be growing support in Japan for tougher export controls on technology towards China?
I feel that the more and more the Japanese security experts support the higher restrictions on the very sensitive technologies for exporting China, but still it's very difficult for the Japanese business side to conduct the strict technology restrictions to transfer between Japan and China, because Japan really needs the supporting base, the China as a the supply base.
So to conclude, you can tell from these 4 excellent presentations that Japan is also, like the US, like Europe, like Australia and Canada, is also struggling to define competition without catastrophe or without damage to the economic interests. That debate's very important for the US. I would argue that no country other than China will have more influence on the US-China policy than Japan. Japan is going to be the most important variable in how the US approaches China, after China itself. I think the debates in Japan in some ways have preceded the debates in the US or Europe. Japan has been struggling with this longer, as Aoyama Sensei describes in her excellent paper. So there's a lot we can learn. I want to thank you all. The papers are now on the website at CSIS for everyone to read. I want to thank Ito Sensei, Inoue Sensei, Aoyama Sensei, and Iida Sensei for your excellent scholarship and collegiality, and Matt Goodman for joining me, and Nick St. Cheney and Hannah Fodale for leading this project. Thank you all for joining us, and hope you enjoyed the papers. All the best.